Good afternoon, everybody. I'm delighted to welcome you all here as part of our Harleston's Future Mayflower Lecture Series. And this afternoon, I'm extremely delighted to welcome Jeff Doggett to talk to us about the two Mayflowers, the one that crossed the Atlantic in 1620 and the 1950s version. Jeff is a lifelong sailor in a wooden ship, as he will tell you, and he'll give you lots more details about this one. So over to Jeff.
So there is some explanatory text all through this, which read ahead if you like, but I will be talking around it. So I hope you can plug in your hearing aids and listen to me as well as read what's actually on the screen. So what started all this was my lifelong passion for sailing. I've always had a great interest in wooden boats, from my first dinghies, which were wood, little mirror dinghies, through to my current boat, which you'll see a picture of later on. It's a wooden boat built in the same yard as the second Mayflower. And that was what spurred me on to trying to link all this together. Now, Mayflower 400 has been so incredibly well publicized and researched that, as I'm not a historian, I'm bound to get a few facts wrong. I'm trying to tell a few stories here and look at one or two angles which may not have been very well covered in the normal formal stuff. Right, so we're going to talk about, first of all, the two famous Mayflowers. I think most people, of course, understand there was the original Mayflower. Many of you will understand there was a replica built in the 50s. I'm going to tell her story, and I'm going to draw out some comparisons between the two. I'm going to delve in a fairly simple, non-technical way into the ships themselves, how wooden ships came to be designed, evolved and designed, and some comments on navigation and the sailing of the ships, because it was an incredibly intrepid adventure which the separatists took when they went on the original Mayflower. But in my researches, I've come across loads of other Mayflowers, many of them all sailing in the 17th century. And so I thought, what's going on here? How solid is the information about the Mayflower we have come to love? So there are some mysteries and myths. And then a final challenge, with it being a bit stormy here in England at the minute, whether any of us would relish going down and getting on board a boat which leaked, all wooden boats leak, trusting absolutely to God and nobody else that you were going to go across some pretty stormy water at a time of the year which was not the right time of year to be going across the Atlantic. And somebody mentioned to me the other day, it's pretty much like putting yourself into the Apollo spacecraft and heading for the moon. It was that risky, that adventure, that unknown thing, and it just amazes me, I have to say. Now, let's look at the context around the original Mayflower. She was built in or around 1609, and probably in Harwich. I say probably because the big story is that she was built in Harwich. But whether that was purely because she was linked to Christopher Jones, her master, or whether she was actually built in Harwich is not 100% proven. And the people in Harwich have been trying to get together a replica, which unfortunately is a project that stalled completely 2 years ago. They've run out of money and are not going ahead at all with this, which is sad. But there isn't any great evidence about boatyards in Harwich. So we suppose, and let's live with this story, that she was built and launched in Harwich, probably built of local Suffolk wood or oak, and all her rigging and cordage probably came locally. She was almost certainly commissioned and built for the wine trade, to the Bordeaux wine and so on. So she spent the time between 1609 and 1620 trading mainly in the North Sea, and she was fairly frequently, particularly in her the later few years before 1620, clearly Rotherhithe featured, and she was moored at Rotherhithe. And if you have any questions about Rotherhithe, you have only to ask Chris Green, who has just done a wonderful walking tour and is absolute expert on Rotherhithe in the 17th century. So the very simple story, which all of you know, or most of you know a little bit about, but I think it's worth restating, is that what spurred all this on was separatists who did not get on with either King James I or with the current or the structure of the church, and decided to have a much simpler, more basic life. They were hounded from pillar to post, particularly in Lincolnshire, where there was a big group of them, and eventually they decided to get a bit more freedom by going to Holland, a group of them, and having landed up in Amsterdam, went to the beautiful little university town of Leiden, where they lived and set up for a few years, but were also uncomfortable in Leiden. There are many reasons and stories I've heard to do with the lack of being able to speak Dutch, which I happen to know is an incredibly difficult language to learn and speak. Whether they just weren't very welcome in Leiden, I don't know, but they decided that really they needed something better and fresher, and so the New World was going to be it. They bought a boat called the Speedwell, which was actually owned by the separatists and was a smaller boat than the Mayflower, and the Speedwell brought some of the separatists over and met up with the Mayflower in Southampton in the summer of 1620. Now, the Mayflower, which was the separatists, particularly those still in England, needed a ship, and they hadn't got a lot of money, and so they cut a deal with the merchant venturers in the city of London, who were interested in anybody who would go and explore and set up and start trading in the States, in the New World, and make some money for them. So they put up the money for the hire, and Christopher Jones, who was strictly called the master, he wasn't really the captain, he was the master of the Mayflower and owned a quarter share, which we'll talk about in a minute. Interestingly, ships are sold in shares as 64ths. So he had, I can't do my maths, but he had 18 or whatever, 16 64ths of the ship. That's always been the way that the ownership of a ship is divvied up. So she embarked a group of the separatists, probably from Wapping or from somewhere on the Thames, very close to Rotherhithe, and they sailed round the coast, met up with the Speedwell in Southampton, and then decided off they'd go. Well, they got somewhere off Land's End, down in the western approaches, and the Speedwell, which had already been thought of as being a pretty leaky old tub, said, no, it's leaking far too badly, we've got to come back. So they got back into Dartmouth for repairs to be made to the Speedwell, which was done, and then they set off again, but yet again off the Scilly Isles, somewhere down in the western approaches, she was clearly not going to make the trip. So they both ships came back to Plymouth, which is why Plymouth, of course, is which was the true leaving place for the Mayflower in September, on September the 16th, 1620. And most of you know the famous steps at Plymouth. If not, if you're down there, go and see them. And she sailed across, and we'll talk a little bit more about her voyage, and took 66 days, which is 9 weeks or thereabouts, so quite a long trip, and arrived, having originally probably been setting off for Virginia, but arrived at Cape Cod for various reasons to do with the weather and Christopher Jones's own reasons for taking her a little further north. Then having got to Cape Cod, they then explored a little bit over that winter. Most of the crew and the passengers all stayed on board. Many of them died. It was not good, but eventually they disembarked the separatists at what is now Plymouth, which I've been to, and where the Mayflower 2 resides to this day in very good condition. The Mayflower then returned to England with a presumably reduced crew. She traded for a couple of years, but then Christopher Jones died in 1622, the year after, and she traded on, apparently not in very good condition, until Christopher Jones' widow said she wanted her money back, her quarter share if possible. So they did a valuation on her, a full inventory, and it pretty much showed that she was not in very good condition. And then she was broken up shortly after that. And there are lots of myths and stories about where bits of the Mayflower are in various barns and farm buildings in Dorset, and you name it. People have come up with all sorts of stories about that. So that was the end of the Mayflower as a ship. Now the Mayflower 2, the replica, has a very interesting story, not quite so well known, and it surrounds one man who you can see, I hope, a picture of him in his younger days, a man called Warwick Charlton, who was born in 1918 and from a journalist's family, and he became a journalist. During the war, he had a very interesting job. He became Montgomery's press officer, and it is Warwick Charlton who is attributed with the fact that he was able to tell Monty to take off his general's red striped hat and start wearing a beret. That would do him no end of good with his troops. And he did a great deal for Monty's personal reputation with the troops, and had a rather interesting war. And after the war, when he was back into his journalism, he had this idea of saying thank you to the States for their huge efforts to the Allies in the Second World War. And he thought, what better can we do but build a replica Mayflower? So it was his idea. The whole thing was really his idea. It was, as I put here, an idiosyncratic project. It had all sorts of strange things because he was a very interesting man. And I'll just read a small note which was from his obituary when he died, actually aged 84, so he had a good life. He was a man of great imagination, energy, stamina, ingenuity, humour, and who understood that in order to get a plan off the ground, it was necessary, on occasion, to sail rather close to the wind. Now that's an interesting set of words, because he certainly led from the front and didn't suffer fools gladly. And what happened was he got some plans from the States, and our friends in the Fuller Society and over there will know exactly where those plans came from, but a set of plans came which enabled him to go and find a boat builder. So he needed a wooden boat builder in England to build this replica. The thing is that when he started along this, he had no money and he got no real funding together. He said, the funding will come. And so he decided that he needed the boat builder, and to impress wooden boat builders, he did a short list and found some down, particularly in the West Country. He would impress them to make them think that he'd got plenty of money, which he didn't have. So he actually flew down to, I presume, probably Exeter Airport, and rented a car, a rather large car apparently, or a taxi, and met at the airport Stuart Upham, who was the owner of the boatyard Upham's, which we will look at in a minute, in Brixham. And apparently they didn't exchange any words. It was a completely silent trip because neither knew very much about what they were trying to do. But when they got to the boatyard, everything broke open and they got very, very friendly. And that was why Upham's were chosen as the builder of the Mayflower 2. Unfortunately, as that project pretty much put Upham's out of business because they were wooden boat builders building fishing boats and so on. And while the Mayflower big ship was in their yards, they couldn't take on any other work. And although they'd had a lot of work during the war, and because of the cash flows, thanks to Warwick's lack of money and rather bizarre crowdfunding efforts, the yard closed. Anyway, in the middle of her build in 1956, her keel was laid in 1955, came the Suez crisis, which was a pretty big crisis here in the UK. And anyway, she survived that, and they got her in the water, and she sailed in April. And one part of the contract which Warwick signed with Stuart Upham was that Stuart was to sail as part of the crew with him on the Mayflower 2 to ensure that she didn't sink on the way and was well built. Quite a nice little note. Now, she had a much better, she was captained by a very experienced captain called Captain Villiers, who knew a lot more about the, sorry about that, knew a great deal more about sailing the Atlantic, and of course had much more modern charts and knowledge. And she went a much more southern route and took 54 days for the passage. Now, I've sailed the Atlantic once from the Canaries to Martinique, and it took 29 days. And that's a short trip compared with this particular one. These ships did not travel fast, I can tell you. So you can work it out by the time. They were sailing at probably 3 or 4 knots average all the time. Hello? Sorry about that. Trying to kill my phone. Right, now Mayflower 2, then having done the trip, stayed over in the States. She had a major refurbishment in 2016, 2019 at Mystic Seaport, did a brilliant job, I think $11 million or thereabout in refurbing her, a lot of reconstruction, and now she's in wonderful condition and sits in Plymouth, Massachusetts. Now, interestingly, on the Mayflowers, in 1629, another Mayflower went to New England in May, good time of the year, with 35 passengers, who were also mainly separatists. This Mayflower made further trips in 1630, 1633, 1634, and 1639, and then came to an end in 1641 when she left with 140 passengers, which was a big, big list, but she never arrived in Virginia, where she was headed for, and was therefore deemed a total loss. Now, also on topic of other Mayflowers, in the 17th century, ships weren't necessarily required to be registered as they are now. So it's the ports they traded from and to which really have the only records of these ships. And I found an interesting reference which said that around 1620, probably in and around the UK, there may have been over 50 ships called the Mayflower. So you can see the possibility of a little bit of misinformation here and there coming out. And why was Mayflower? Well, it's a nice name, but it's also the Mayflower itself is the trailing arbutus, which grows in North America and in Europe, and is a very lovely spring flower. So probably a very good name for a ship. So onto the ship herself. She was based on a Dutch design called a flute. I hope I pronounced that right. The Dutch were major boaters and traders, of course, in the 17th century. and they designed many cargo carrying ships, and the flute was really the design which was picked up by our Mayflower. She was about 180 tons. She was somewhere around 80 to 90 feet on the deck, a bit more if you add on the bowsprit and so on. Her beam, her width was 25 feet, which is fairly beamy, and her draft, her depth under the water, the amount of water she needed to float, was 13 feet. And she had 3 masts, which was part of the standard design in those days, a foremast, a bigger main mast, and a mizzen mast. And the fore and the main masts, which I'll show you a picture of in a moment, were actually constructed of 2 parts. The big main mast itself coming up from the keel, and then another top mast strapped on top of that. So it was really quite a hairy way of putting a boat together, and of course had massive amounts of rigging. She had 6 sails. She was what's known as a square rigger, which meant she sailed mainly with the wind behind her or a little bit on her quarter. She couldn't tack, as we think about now, in going up against the wind, but she did have one. Her mizzen sail was in fact a fore and aft sail. And an interesting thing is, when you look at this ship, these ships, they have these very high stern castles, as they were called, and look incredibly unstable and subject to a lot of windage. But in fact, it's been proven that it was a very sensible design, because in gales, that big stern caught the wind and made the ship weathercock, which means it put the bows up into the wind naturally without the use of the sails. So it's actually quite a safe design. And as I'm sure most of you realize, boats very much evolve from one century to another and one type to another, because of that's the way things go. And the final point about her and her dimensions, we'll look at a picture of her structure. Her gun deck was a mere 50 foot by 25 feet, and that was where the over 100 passengers were living for 9 weeks. I don't think we need a great imagination to understand how miserable and grim life would be, and it was only 5 foot high, so most people were crawling around bent, almost bent double. So here's a schematic of how she was put together. So starting from the left, she had this big high castle, as it was called, with a poop deck right up at the stern, which was where the master and the pilot could see well forward. Underneath was a little space, a poop house out of the wet, and underneath the cabin, which was the master's cabin, that was where Master Christopher lived, and probably had 2 or 3 of the officers living and sleeping in there with him, the senior officers. Now, just in front of that, you'll see the steerage room, and one of the interesting features of design of these ships was how they were steered. They didn't have a wheel. The wheels came a lot later, and you had a pilot. The pilot was a pretty critical, one of the most important officers in the crew, and he was in the steerage room, and he had a compass, and he had above him was a hatch through which the master or the other crews would shout at him and say, left a bit, right a bit, whatever. And the steerage, that big stick sticking up, which is called a whipstaff, was just directly connected to the tiller. It's a pretty grim sort of way of steering a boat. Then there's the big capstan forward of that, which was used for all sorts of purposes, including pulling sails up, but also putting cargo into the hold. The gun room at the stern, because all of these ships, merchant ships, well, nearly all of them, were armed because they were subject to a lot of piracy. And so they had this gun deck, which you'll see to the right, which was the main space underneath the main deck. And that was where all the passengers had to live. Underneath that is the cargo hold, which was absolutely packed full of provisions and all sorts of things needed for these long voyages. Further forward, you've got another windlass, and then the forecastle, or forecastle, which name still comes through today. I have a forecastle in my boat right up at the pointy bits where we can sleep, and that was where the crew, the rest of the 30 crew, slept, and also was where they cooked, where the galley was. Then a foremast, and then what's called the beak, right at the front for rather obvious reasons, and the bowsprit. And usually sitting in the front there was a hatch and a hole, which was where you could go and do your business if you wished, because you can imagine the only other way of doing anything was bucket and chuck it. Now, she was built using oak, as all the ships were in those days. Everything was hand tools, and you will see in a minute Warwick, when he wanted the Mayflower 2 built, insisted that all her work was done with adzes, all done by hand. Now, I'm going to show you a short video. I hope we've got time, this will work. Just a couple of minutes of showing you actual work at Upham's on the Mayflower 2. You'll see, be amazed just how much hard work it is. There were very few plans for the original Mayflower. She was pretty much a known design, and it was all done by experienced shipwrights. And the masts were really often spruce or pine to get that long, straight piece of timber. So let's have a little look, see if I can fire this up at a little video. This is silent, so I will talk a little bit over it. You can see the massive frames, the size of them. Now, here's the wood being brought into the lumber yard from the forests and the sawmills. And the boatyard was just literally what it is. It was a yard on which the boat was put up, and you can see the size of some of these frames, these great big oak frames. I'm not quite sure what he's doing there, but he's passionate about it. And here we are with these guys using their adzes. I think it's just absolutely fascinating, how incredible craftsmanship. So there we can see the size. That was pretty much how she would have been launched, and then the top sides were all built after she was launched, decks put on and so on. That certainly isn't a 17th century saw, but it's certainly a 1950s saw. And they put her together in about a year, give or take the Suez Crisis. So there we go. Try and just get back to the where we were. Okay, I hope everybody can see all this. Are still with me? Now here's the yard, Upham's, where Mayflower 2 was built in Brixham. Just a rather ramshackle set of sheds. The yard had been going since 1802, and shortly after the Mayflower 2 was built, Stuart Upham, who owned the yard, unfortunately went into receivership because they weren't taking on any other work while the Mayflower was built, and they just didn't have enough business. But she was bought by a man called Jack Holman, and Jack's brother, Kim Holman, to those of us who are sailors, particularly on the East Coast, is a very well-known name and was a very well-respected designer. And he had a working relationship with Upham's, run by his brother, and they built, Upham's went on to build about 500 yachts. Here is my yacht, Sister Moon, on the Orwell, and that's the sort of boat which they built, and finally they closed in 1986. Now, there's an awful lot of stuff on a ship like the Mayflower. Ropes were made from locally grown hemp, and one of the intriguing things, thanks to a good friend of mine, Tim Holt Wilson, who sent me a little paper about hemp being grown in the Waveney Valley, all around us here in Harleston and Diss, was the original material provider for rope. It had hard, tough threads, which were quite long, usually about 10 feet in length, from a full-grown hemp, which, by the way, is a cannabis plant, but I don't think they were doing the social exercising with cannabis then that they are now. And hemp was used widely for all sorts of things, of course, clothing, even sailcloth, canvas, ropes and cords. And South Norfolk was growing at one time something like an eighth of all the hemp in England. So there is this small possibility that hemp from here in the Waveney Valley actually got on board the Mayflower when she was being built in Harwich, but there's absolutely no evidence. It's one of my little conjectures. The ropes were made in rope walks, which I'll show you a picture of, and anybody who's watching Tony Robinson's programme last night about the Thames will have seen the rope walk, or the ropery as it's called, in Chatham. Very interesting place. And the sails were also made from hemp or canvas, and almost certainly one of the crew on board the Mayflower would have been a sailmaker, and he would have been pretty permanently busy. The other key man, of course, was a carpenter who would have been constantly stopping up leaks and so on. Now, I only show you this picture to show you, you won't be able to read anything on the detail on it, but to show you how complicated the rigging is. And each of those little bits of rope and that diagram has a number. And here is a description of the names of all of those bits of rope. There were sheets, and there were halyards, and there were clewlines and bowlines, and goodness knows whatever else. So if you were a competent crew, you pretty much had to know all these names, because you had to pull on them and do things with them. So very complicated, very interesting. And this is the tackle, which was on the Mayflowers. And here's the rope walk, which is very long. The Chatham one, they have a bike. You can ride all the way down as this strange machine slowly goes down the whole length of it, making a long piece of rope, and it twists the cords of rope around each other to make effectively a braided rope. It's a fascinating process, and the Chatham, if you're ever in that area, I do suggest you go and have a look at this working rope work, which is still making rope for instance, the Cutty Sark, who has something, I think, over 50 miles of rope in her rigging. Now, her passage of the original Mayflower was really probably heading for Virginia, which was the authorised plantation which James I would have authorised them to land at. But they went a bit further north. They took a quite northerly passage, and this was not very good news in the autumn, because we get winter storms piling across the Atlantic, mainly from the southwest, in exactly the opposite direction for the ship to go. And so it was a pretty rough and horrible trip. It was very uncomfortable. That picture on the right is by no means the maximum degree of roll which a ship like this would have, and so the passengers would not have spent much time up on the deck, and it's amazing that no more got swept overboard. One, I think he's probably a crew member, did get swept overboard on the Mayflower, but fortunately picked up a a trailing rope and managed to get back on board, which was a miracle. This voyage started with quite good wind. They had a week of quite good winds in the right direction and all fairly calm, but then it all went pear-shaped and it was not good. And those of you who've had the misfortune to suffer from mal de mer or seasickness know what a miserable thing it is. Death is usually the preferable option, and the amount of seasickness with no quells or copper bands or anything else to go by must have been horrendous. The Mayflower 2 had a much better passage because she left at the right time of the year and took a more southerly course and only had 30 people on board, and they had a reasonably safe and comfortable passage. Navigation of these ships it's all well known that it's really an art, not a science. There wasn't very much in the way of scientific knowledge or instrumentation to help navigation. What did happen was each day started at noon, because that was when the sun was at its highest, and even though there were no good clocks or chronometers at that stage, it was pretty much a reference point for the beginning of the day. And it wasn't until later that longitude, i.e. your east-west orientation, could be measured. There was no means of doing that because you needed time and accurate chronometers, and that's the wonderful story of the Harrisons and the Harrison clocks, which you can see at the Greenwich Observatory. So they worked on the basis of latitude, which was measured by the sun and the horizon, a very, very early form of sextant. And there's a cross staff on the right. That was the sort of instrument they would use. So they'd probably take a fix at 4-hourly intervals during daylight and probably nothing much at night. And the other things they used was what's called dead reckoning, which is where you're trying to create a record of what direction you're sailing in from the compass and your speed, which means chucking a bit of wood over the side and timing it for how long it takes to get from the front of the boat to the back. That gives you your log, and that's where the term knots comes from, because the rope was knotted. Now, the Mayflower 2, things have progressed substantially, but Warwick was pretty keen that everything should be done as basically as possible. And although there were very good electronics, Decca and so on, although they wouldn't have worked in the Atlantic, there were electronic navigational systems, of course, after the Second World War. The sextant was only invented around 1730 and is a very interesting instrument, which I used to be able to use, but I've completely forgotten how to use, where you bring, with your sight, you bring the sun down to the horizon, measure the angle, and then start getting out some log tables and doing some fiendish maths, and you should end up with a little triangle of certainty. And you'll be, if you're really good, you're within about 5 miles out in the ocean. If you're not so good as I was, somewhere around 50 miles, but you did get to know roughly where you were. And you can do it at night with the celestial bodies and the stars. And of course, there was a compass and a log on board Mayflower 2. The real improvement they had was much better charts. And of course, Captain Villiers, who was a very experienced ocean sailor, knew the weather and current patterns in the North Atlantic much, much better than in 1620. So here we are now with the Mayflower 2. This is what she looks like. I'm not certain. I think my American friends will tell me that that is actually probably Mystic Seaport, not Plymouth. But she's in extremely good condition thanks to all the work done on her. And there she is as a true memorial of the original Mayflower's trip, and also Warwick Charlton's amazing vision. So we're just nearly at an end now, and I thought we'd have this. I just absolutely love this painting. I think it's a very famous one, but the devil is in the detail. And if you look in here, you can see Mayflower being provisioned in Plymouth just before she sets sail. Passengers being blessed and saying their last prayers and so on. apples, it looks like, on the left there, and food all being taken on board. Children, you know, it was an intrepid adventure. It really was.
Thank you very much, Jeff. That was absolutely brilliant. I thoroughly enjoyed that, and I'm sure everybody else here did as well. There is a lot more information about this topic, and if you go through to our website or look at our YouTube channel, you will find details of that, and this presentation will be set up on that channel as well. Next meeting is Gordon Lascelles, and he will be talking about Old Harleston. And again, look on our website, visit harleston.org.uk. Thank you very much for coming this afternoon.